There is a kind of change that does not announce itself. It does not arrive with a crisis or a decision. There is no morning when you wake up and say, "I am done imagining my future." There is no conversation, no turning point, no visible break. It happens more quietly than that, and usually more slowly. But somewhere in the second half of life, for many people, somewhere between the mid-50s and the early 70s, the habit of looking forward begins to thin. The future stops feeling like a wide open space and starts feeling more like a passage. Not a threatening one, not a dark one, just narrower than it used to be. And somehow, without quite deciding to, you stop standing at the window and looking out. You may have noticed this in small ways. You used to make plans for years from now. You thought about where you might travel eventually, what you might do when the kids were older, what the house might look like after this renovation, what your days might feel like once things settled down. There was a quiet habit of projection, of imagining yourself in the future as a person with more time, more freedom, more choices. The future was somewhere you were going. And at some point, the plans got shorter. The horizons came closer, not from fear, necessarily. Often it felt like wisdom. A more realistic, less wishful relationship with time. You stopped projecting 5 years ahead and started thinking about the next season, the next month, the next few weeks. And that felt reasonable. That felt like something you had earned. But there is a question underneath that feeling, and it is worth asking. Is this peace, or is this something else? Because there is a version of this that is genuinely healthy, the gradual, honest acceptance that time is limited, that some things will not happen, that the future is not infinite and never was. That version of shrinking is not resignation, it is clarity. And there is something genuinely beautiful about a person who has learned to want what they actually have. But there is another version, and it is harder to name. It is the version where the future got smaller not because you accepted it, but because disappointment quietly taught you to protect yourself from it. Where the horizon closed not because you made peace with time, but because time, over the years, had become something you had learned to be careful around. And those two things, peace and protection, can look exactly the same from the outside. They can even feel the same from the inside, at first. This episode is about the difference between them. It is not a call to optimism. It is not going to tell you to make a bucket list, set ambitious goals, or live each day as if it were your last. That is not the kind of conversation this is. What it is about, instead, is a quieter question. What does it mean to still look forward? Not desperately, not with grand ambition, not with the urgent energy of someone trying to outrun time, but with something as simple and as necessary as curiosity. The belief that the months and years ahead are worth imagining, even if you cannot see them clearly, even if they will not go exactly as planned. Because that belief, held quietly, is more important than most people realize. And it is more fragile than it appears. We are going to look at why the future goes quiet. We are going to look at what it costs when it does. We are going to examine the harder question of how you tell the difference between peace and surrender. And at the end, we are going to sit with what it might mean to hold the future again, not tightly, not demandingly, but with a kind of ongoing, humble curiosity. To understand why the future gets quieter with age, it helps to understand what the future actually is, not philosophically, but practically. For most of adult life, the future is structured. It has a shape. There are things to plan for, deadlines to meet, milestones to anticipate. A career builds toward something. Children move through stages that orient the family calendar. A mortgage runs for 30 years, and somewhere in the middle of it, you can almost see the end. Even problems have a future-facing quality. If we can get through this, things will be better. If I can hold on a little longer, something will change. This structure is invisible until it disappears. But it is the scaffolding of forward-looking thought. Without it, the future does not necessarily become threatening, it simply becomes vague. And vague futures are hard to inhabit in the imagination. They do not pull you toward them. They do not give you a direction. They simply stretch out, quietly, without demanding your attention. Psychologists who study time and aging have documented something called the narrowing of the temporal horizon, the natural tendency, as people age, to perceive the future as shorter, less open, and less dominant in their thinking. This is not purely a matter of being pessimistic or giving up. It appears to be a relatively consistent pattern across many cultures and many different kinds of people. The researcher Laura Carstensen at Stanford has spent decades studying how time perception changes with age, and her work suggests something counterintuitive. The awareness that time is limited actually changes what people value and how they use their attention. Older adults tend to shift toward what is present, meaningful, and certain, the relationships they already have, the pleasures that are already available, the work that already matters. This shift is often accompanied by genuine emotional richness. Many older adults, by various measures of well-being, report higher levels of emotional satisfaction than younger people. But there is a version of this shift that overshoots. When the orientation toward the present becomes so complete that the future disappears entirely. When a person stops imagining what comes next, stops planning, stops wondering, stops caring about the months ahead with any real investment, something important is lost. Not just practically, in terms of decisions and preparations, but psychologically. Because imagining the future is not the same as demanding certainty from it. It is not the same as clinging to plans or refusing to accept change. It is the much quieter act of continuing to be curious about what comes next. And that kind of curiosity, once lost, is hard to recover. There is also a structural reason why the future gets quieter after retirement, and it has less to do with age and more to do with what retirement actually removes from a person's life. Work, whatever its frustrations, whatever its costs, creates a future. It creates deadlines, projects, quarterly targets, annual reviews, 5-year plans. It creates a sense of trajectory, however modest. Next year I will be somewhere slightly different than I am now. There is movement, there is direction. Even if the movement is not toward somewhere wonderful, it is movement nonetheless. The removal of that trajectory, which is what retirement does on its first morning, is far more disorienting than most people anticipate. Not because people miss work exactly, though some do, but because the future that work used to generate is suddenly gone, and nothing has been put in its place. The same is true of family milestones. Graduations, weddings, the birth of grandchildren, the school years. These structure the calendar of a family's future. When you have children in school, you have a future that is measured in years and shaped by their progress. When those milestones become less frequent, or happen far away, or stop happening at all, the calendar can begin to feel indifferentiated. January looks much like June. Next year looks much like this one. None of this is a personal failure. It is what happens when the external structures that used to do the work of forward-looking are quietly removed. The world built a future for you, through work, through family, through obligation, and then retired that machinery without quite replacing it. The question is whether people notice the scaffolding is gone, and whether they decide to build something internal in its place. Most people do not decide consciously. They drift. The days fill with present tense things. The news, the grandchildren, the garden, the doctor's appointments, the daily pleasures that are genuinely good and genuinely worth having. And the future, undemanded, slowly stops being something they visit. This is understandable. It is also worth examining. Because the future is not just where plans live. It is where hope lives. It is where the self that is still becoming lives. And a person who has stopped visiting that space has not necessarily found peace. Sometimes they have simply stopped looking. The cost of a closing future does not show up in a single moment. It accumulates slowly, in what is never attempted. There is the trip that was meant to happen eventually. The one that was discussed, perhaps many times, over many years. The country they always meant to visit. The road they always meant to drive. And at some point, without a decision being made, it stopped being discussed. Not because it became impossible. Because it quietly moved from the category of things that will happen to the category of things that might have been. And that transition happened without anyone noticing it. There is the project that was kept for later. The book, the garden, the renovation, the course, the skill. Something they were always going to get to when the time was right. And at some point, the time stopped feeling right, not urgently, not with a dramatic closing of the door, but steadily. And the project remained in a drawer somewhere, under a quiet layer of someday that gradually hardened into never. There is the relationship that could have deepened. The old friend from 40 years ago who was thought about sometimes, warmly, but never quite called. The family member with whom there was always a little distance that could, in theory, be crossed. And the years passed, and the call was never made, and now the distance is simply the distance. These things do not feel like losses at the time. That is partly what makes them hard to name. They feel like reasonable choices, like practicality, like acceptance, and sometimes they are. Not every trip needs to be taken, not every project started, not every relationship deepened. Life is finite, and choosing what to pursue means leaving other things unpursued. That is not a failure, that is how time works. But there is a different kind of not doing, and it is worth distinguishing. It is the kind where the reason is not genuine choice but quiet fear. Where the trip was not taken because you actually did not want it anymore, but because somewhere along the way you stopped believing it would go well. Where the project was not started because you actually preferred other things, but because you had stopped believing you had the capacity to see it through. Where the relationship was not deepened because you were genuinely at peace with the distance, but because connecting takes vulnerability, and disappointment had made you careful. Disappointment is the key here, and it deserves more attention than it usually gets. Over a life, disappointment accumulates. Plans that did not work out, hopes that were not fulfilled, relationships that hurt more than expected, work that did not go where it was supposed to go, health that changed sooner than anyone wanted, financial security that turned out to be less secure than it seemed. None of these are unusual. All of them leave a mark. And one of the marks they leave is a kind of protective wanting less. A rational adaptation. If I want less, I will be disappointed less. If I expect less, life can still meet my expectations. If I stop imagining the future too vividly, it cannot let me down. This is sensible. It is also, over time, a slow contraction. And left unexamined, it can become the shape of a life, not a choice, but a default. A future that has been made safe by being made small. A person who has quietly moved from being someone who imagines what comes next to someone who simply waits for it. The grief in this is real, even if it is quiet. Because the things that were never attempted were real possibilities. They were not fantasies. They were the actual territory of a life that was still open, and that, for reasons that accumulated gradually, was never entered. And the harder truth is that this kind of grief is almost never acknowledged. Because there is no funeral for a plan that was never made. There is no moment of reckoning for the project that stayed permanently in the drawer. The loss is invisible, because it never quite happened. But it was a loss nonetheless, the quiet erasure of a version of yourself that might have been, if you had kept looking forward a little longer. The hardest question in this conversation is the one that is most personal. How do you tell the difference? How do you know, honestly, whether your calm about the future is peace or protection? Whether the quieting of future dreaming is something you chose with full awareness, or something that happened to you so gradually that you never had the chance to decide? This is not a question that has a clean answer. It is not the kind of thing you can settle in an afternoon. But there are certain things worth sitting with. The first is this. Peace with the future generally includes the future. It does not require the future to disappear. A person who has genuinely made peace with the passage of time can still be curious about what comes next. They can still want things, not frantically, not with the urgency of someone trying to squeeze everything in before it is too late, but quietly, naturally, as a matter of ongoing interest in the life ahead. Peace, in its truest form, is not the absence of hope. It is hope that has learned to exist without demanding certainty. What the protection version of quieting looks like is different. It looks like the careful absence of investment. The reflexive response when asked about the future. It does not really matter, I am fine with whatever happens. The willingness, even eagerness, to say I am too old for that before the question has even been fully posed. The complete shift of imagination from the future to the past. The life lived over and over in memory, while the life still to be lived sits unexamined. There is also the cultural dimension to this, which is worth naming plainly. The culture around aging, at least in most Western societies, contains a quiet but persistent message. That aspiration in later life is unseemly. That wanting things, making plans, imagining possibilities is for the young. That the appropriate attitude for older adults is a kind of graceful diminishment, becoming less demanding, less ambitious, less forward-facing. Taking up less space, wanting less, expecting less. This message is rarely stated directly, but it is encoded in 1,000 small moments. The way a person's plans are gently redirected when they seem too large. The knowing looks when someone in their 60s mentions something they're hoping to do. The jokes about aging that position forward dreaming as naive, or as denial, rather than as the healthy habit it has always been. And the problem with absorbing that message, which most people do, to some degree, without realizing it, is that it conflates two different things. It conflates accepting the limits of time, which is wisdom, with accepting a smaller imagination, which is something else entirely. You can know that you are not going to live forever and still make plans for 3 years from now. You can know that your health is not what it was and still wonder what the next chapter might look like. You can be completely at peace with your own mortality, can have thought about it, accepted it, even made practical arrangements for it, and still be genuinely curious about the months and years ahead. Mortality and imagination are not opposites. They never were. Some of the most vivid forward-looking in history has been done by people who knew perfectly well that their time was limited. Not in denial of that fact, but in full awareness of it, choosing to look ahead anyway, because the looking itself has value. There is also something important in the distinction between expectation and curiosity. Expectation says, I imagine the future, and it must go the way I have imagined. This is the version that ends in bitterness. The future that refuses to cooperate becomes an enemy. And this is often what people are retreating from when they stop imagining. Not the future itself, but the pain of expectation unmet. They have been disappointed too many times, and they have learned, correctly, that holding the future too tightly causes suffering. But the retreat from expectation does not have to mean the retreat from imagination. It can mean something different. The move from expecting to wondering. Curiosity says something lighter. It says, I wonder what comes next. Not with certainty, not with demands, but with the same quiet attention you might give to a story you are reading without knowing the ending. You are invested, you care how it goes. But you are not the author, and you know it, and somehow that is all right. That distinction, between expecting and wondering, is perhaps the most important reframe this conversation can offer. Because wondering requires almost nothing. It does not require confidence in the future. It does not require good health, financial security, or a calendar full of plans. It requires only the willingness to remain interested in what comes next. And that willingness, kept alive even in modest, quiet form, is what separates a life that is still open from a life that has already, in some important sense, decided it is finished. The philosopher William James wrote, a long time ago, that the greatest revolution of his generation was the discovery that human beings, by changing the inner attitudes of their minds, can change the outer aspects of their lives. He was not talking about optimism exactly. He was talking about attention. About where you choose to direct your awareness. To keep some of your attention in the future, not obsessively, not anxiously, but habitually, with a kind of steady, quiet curiosity, is not wishful thinking. It is one of the most fundamentally human things a person can do. It is the thing that distinguishes a life that is still in motion from a life that has already arrived at its conclusion. And the conclusion is worth deferring, for as long as honestly possible. This is not the kind of episode that ends with a list of things to do. There is no challenge to take on, no goal to set by the end of the week, no instruction to seize the remaining days with a fresh sense of purpose. That language belongs to a different kind of conversation, and this is not it. What this conversation has tried to do, instead, is name something that often goes unnamed. The quiet closing of the future-facing self, and the importance of noticing it. Because there is a difference, a real and meaningful difference, between two kinds of calm. There is the calm of a person who has made genuine peace with time. Who knows what they have, values it honestly, and holds the future with a light and curious hand. Who is not anxious about what comes next, but is still present to it, still wondering, still imagining, still allowing the months ahead to matter. This kind of calm is hard to reach, and when a person carries it, it is genuinely beautiful. And then there is the calm that comes from having quietly stopped. From having narrowed the future down so completely that it no longer poses any risk. The calm of having decided, not consciously but gradually, that wanting things was more trouble than it was worth. This version also feels like peace. But it is a different kind. The stillness of something that has ceased to move, rather than the stillness of something at rest. The goal is not to distinguish between these two states and then feel ashamed of whichever one is closer to the truth. The goal is simply to notice, honestly, which one you are in. Because the first kind of calm is something you can return to. Even if the future has gone quiet for a while, it can be spoken to again. Not with grand gestures or dramatic changes, but with small, quiet acts of forward-looking. A question asked with genuine interest. What would I want the next year to look like? A plan made without demanding it go perfectly. A curiosity allowed about something that might happen, without needing certainty that it will. None of this requires optimism in the conventional sense. It does not require the belief that everything will work out, or that the future is full of good surprises waiting to be discovered. It requires only the willingness to keep looking, to stay turned toward what comes next, even partially, even tentatively. And that willingness matters more than it might seem. Because the future is not only where plans live, it is where the version of yourself that is still becoming lives. And a person who has stopped looking toward that space has not only given up on planning. They have, in some quiet way, given up on becoming. They have decided, perhaps without realizing it, that they are already who they are going to be. That may be true, eventually. But it is probably not true yet. There is time, still, to keep wondering. There are months ahead that you have not lived yet. There are conversations that have not happened, mornings that have not come, small surprises that the future has not yet delivered. None of them are guaranteed, but all of them are possible. And the willingness to hold that possibility, lightly, without grasping, without demanding, is what keeps a life open. Perhaps the most honest thing to say at the end of this conversation is something like this. The future will close eventually. There will come a time, for all of us, when the horizon genuinely shortens and the remaining time is genuinely limited. That is not a tragedy. It is simply how life works. And making peace with it, truly and honestly, is one of the harder and more important tasks of being human. But that time is not the same as now. And confusing the two, treating today's life as if it were already the last chapter, contracting the self prematurely, closing the window before the view has ended, is not wisdom. It is a kind of early arrival at a place you are not quite meant to be yet. The window is still open. The view is still there, and you do not have to look at it with urgency or fear. You only have to keep looking. That is enough.